Thank you, Mark. Now, as Mark indicated, the crisis in Afghanistan and the decision to admit tens of thousands of Afghan nationals to the United States in an emergency situation has prompted a lot of interest in, well, how do Afghan immigrants do, or even how many are already here? And we can gain some insight on that question by looking at the data the government has collected. In the report I'm going to discuss today, it mostly all comes from what's called the American Community Survey collected by the Census Bureau. The analysis was done by myself and my colleague Karen Ziegler, and that report in full is available on our website. It mainly just focuses on numbers. So overall, in a nutshell, the population of Afghans has grown rapidly. It tends to be concentrated in a few states and metropolitan areas. And we also found that a large fraction, but by no means all, struggle in the United States. So just briefly going over the numbers, the number of Afghan immigrants in the United States has really taken off in the last 10 years. In 2010, it was about 55,000. The latest data from the Census Bureau for 2019, and most all the data I'll be talking about today is from 2019, is 133,000. So about 2.5 times or 2.5-fold increase just in 10 years. That's several times faster than the overall immigrant population grew. And when I use the term immigrant here, let me say that I'm defining it sort of colloquially, not the technical definition of someone who has a green card. An immigrant in this context means the foreign-born, people who are not U.S. citizens at birth, and it would include naturalized citizens, green card holders, temporary visitors, and even the illegal immigrants that are picked up by the Census Bureau in its American Community Survey. So where do they live? Well, they tend to be concentrated. The top 3 states of settlement are California, Virginia, and Texas. They have the lion's share. The top metro areas are Washington, D.C., that includes Maryland as well, and also San Francisco and Sacramento. Why that's important is we would expect that the newly arrived Afghans, a very large share, will end up in the D.C. area or California as well. So the biggest impact is likely to be in those areas because there's a large body of research showing that if you want to know where immigrants this year are going to go, it's where immigrants went last year. Yes, there are always new areas of settlement, and immigrants do tend to move to new places over time. But in general, migration is driven often by social networks, and those social networks tend to draw people to wherever the existing population is. Now, when we look at the overall Afghan immigrant population in the United States, it's overwhelmingly been allowed in for humanitarian reasons. That is about 79% of all visas given to, or I should say green cards, that's permanent residency, in the last 4 decades have been for humanitarian reasons. That is, they're either refugees or people who applied for asylum once here, or the new category of SIV visas, which is for people with some association with the U.S. government, and they're now in danger in Afghanistan. So we let them in, and we've been letting them in sizable numbers since 2008 for that. For all intents and purposes, they are different categories. We have experts here who could go into more detail, but they're all basically humanitarian immigrants. And for example, they all have the same welfare eligibility, so they're similar in that sense. One of the other things the data show is that Afghans tend to have relatively high rates of citizenship, and this is true even though a large fraction are recent arrivals. As I said, the population has grown a lot. Their citizenship rates at 81% are a good deal higher than that of immigrants overall, and that's only looking at people who've been here for 5 years or more. Now, one of the key things we found was that Afghan immigrants tend to be significantly less educated than the native-born. Interestingly, we also found that their education levels have fallen both in absolute terms and relative to the native-born as well. Just to give you one example, the share with a bachelor's degree was about 30% in 2000, and now it's about 26%. And at the same time, it increased for the native-born from 27 to 35%. So if we look at adults, we find that natives became significantly more educated over the last 2 decades, but the Afghan population actually became somewhat less educated. At the bottom end, about 22% of Afghans don't have a high school degree, didn't graduate high school. That's what they told the survey data takers. And that's about 3 times the rate for the native-born. About 7% of native-born adults have not graduated high school. So we see this big fall in education, and that has lots of consequences because, in a nutshell, education is probably the single best predictor of how you're going to do in the United States, whether we look at your income, poverty rates, welfare use, what kind of job you hold, and what have you. And as a consequence, partly anyway, of their lower levels of education, Afghans tend to have much higher rates of poverty and near poverty. Very roughly speaking, Afghan rates are about double that of the native-born. So about 25% of people who live in Afghan households, which is essentially Afghan immigrants and their U.S.-born children, about 25% live in poverty and 51% live near poverty. Now, the reason their poverty rates are high partly reflects their education level, but another interesting fact about Afghans is that the rates of work among Afghan women is extremely low. So Afghan households, not surprisingly, are much larger on average, but they don't have more workers on average than does the native-born. As a consequence, they have less income coming in, and so a much larger end up in poverty or near poverty for the Afghans. Again, rates about twice. Now, that doesn't mean that Afghan men don't work. Their rates of work are as high or higher than the native-born, but Afghan women have much lower rates of work, and that tends to reduce the overall household income. Now, partly because their income is so low, a very large fraction of Afghans access the welfare system. 65% of all households in 2019 accessed one of the welfare programs that we can measure with the American Community Survey. That means they get cash, someone in the household is on Medicaid, or someone gets food stamps, also referred to as the SNAP program. That is much, much higher than the rate for the native-born, which is around 24%. If we look at welfare as well, we find very rapid increases. Back in 2010, about 50% of Afghan households used a major welfare program. Now it's about 65%, and this data is understating welfare use, so the actual rate is probably higher. Food stamp use has probably increased the most. Since 2010, it's gone from 19% to 35% for Afghan households, while it actually fell for native households to 10%, and it was always much lower anyway. Now, the rise in welfare use is somewhat puzzling because although Afghans do have much higher poverty and much higher rates of near poverty, they always have. In fact, their economic condition hasn't worsened, but their use of welfare has. And this likely reflects the success of refugee resettlement agencies in signing Afghan immigrants up for various forms of welfare. That's important because it probably means that future Afghan immigrants are going to be in that same pipeline and make heavy access of these programs as well. Now, I should say there's just no question that Afghan immigrants admitted today will do better over time. But when we look at the progress of Afghan immigrants over time, we don't really see convergence towards the native-born, and the main reason for that is the lower levels of education. Just to give you one example, if you look at Afghans who arrived 15 years ago, their poverty rates and near poverty rates are still dramatically higher. If we look at those who came 15 years ago, for example, about 47% living near near poverty, much higher than the rates for the native-born. But that doesn't mean that they don't make progress. It just means they don't match the native-born. So in conclusion, I'd say, look, many Afghan immigrants clearly struggle in the United States. And this creates significant challenges for them and for our country. Policymakers, I think, have to think long and hard about how we might better help Afghan immigrants already here or any we admit in the future to better adapt to life in the United States. Or alternatively, whether it makes more sense to help them resettle in countries in their own region. Help those countries accommodate Afghans, as those countries tend to be at a more similar level of development to Afghanistan and are culturally more similar. So that might be very helpful. These are some of the policy alternatives, but it's still very likely that a lot of Afghan immigrants will be wanting to come here, a lot more people in Afghanistan. And we have to think about what's the best way to approach that situation, given what the data tell us about how they'll do once here. Thank you.